Our speaker today, Dave Campbell. I'm not going to go through his long CV because I didn't print it out and bring it, and it would take the whole morning to get through all of his publications and honors and awards. But I think the important thing to note is that we are very lucky to have in South Bend this great scholar who is one of the world's topmost specialists on religion and politics in the United States. He's professor of American democracy at Notre Dame, and he's very busy these days as director of the Notre Dame Democracy Initiative, which is like a campus-wide project that involves all the schools and departments and organizes a ton of activities. So he's been very busy with that and is still busy with that. And so we're lucky to get him here on a Sunday morning. I don't think we would get him if he didn't have a personal interest in studying congregations and religions and religious beliefs and their relationship to political behavior. And I just want to say he's just a marvelous speaker. When he was doing his graduate work at Harvard, his mentor was Robert Putnam, who many of you have heard of as the author of Bowling Alone and many other books. In fact, they had, from my perception, Dave has not told me this, but I think they had kind of a mind meld while he was there and in the years afterwards. In fact, they went on a speaking, like a lecture tour together and filled auditoriums all across the country talking about their work on religion and democracy and politics. I also wanted to say that I had nothing to do with organizing this service. Ann Mannix did everything, even though she asked me to help, and I consistently said no. I'm not doing that to avoid blame, because there will be no blame. This will be fantastic. So I want to make sure that Ann gets all the credit.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I have to say that introduction breaks the first rule of public speaking, which is that you want to keep expectations low. And I will say, just in return, that it's intimidating for me to speak about a subject like democracy with Michael Coppage in the room, he being one of the world's experts on that topic. And it's also great to look out in this group and see that I'm acquainted with some here, and I've gotten to know a few more, and I hope to be able to get to know all of you. I will begin with a confession that maybe you've already inferred, that I am not a Unitarian, but some of my best friends are Unitarians. So I thought I would do a little research before my remarks today so I could read up on the Unitarians, and I was delighted to learn that there has been a Unitarian president. I'm guessing everybody in the audience already knows this, but it was news to me that Millard Fillmore, everyone's favorite president, was a Unitarian. So this means that I swear I will do this. The next time I'm at Disney World and attending the Hall of Presidents, I am going to make a point of cheering when Millard Fillmore is highlighted. So if you've ever been to the Hall of Presidents, they have these animatronic figures. It's all kind of weird, actually, but they all are up on the stage, and they shine the spotlight on each of the presidents in turn. And, Reagan gets cheers, and Obama gets lots of cheers, and others might get, but nobody ever cheers for Fillmore. But I will be the one cheering for Fillmore. Solidarity with the Unitarians. When you're in my line of work, an occupational hazard, of course, is that you get invited to speak to lots of friendly audiences like this. A few years ago, I gave a similar lecture in New York City in a Catholic parish. They had a monthly speaker series. It was actually quite impressive. They brought people in, like me, from all over the place to come and speak to a group. And at the end of my remarks, an older woman came up to me carrying in a towel something I couldn't quite make out what she had, but she explained that she comes every month to that speaker series in her parish, having made a loaf of what she described as her world-famous Irish soda bread. And she said, if I like the speaker, I give them the bread. And if I don't like the speaker, they don't get the bread. I will hold you in suspense of whether or not I got the bread. I am here today, as Michael mentioned in his overly generous introduction. I'm here to talk about American democracy and what religion and religious diversity has to do with democracy in our fair land. And hopefully, by the end of my remarks, I will have convinced you that while American democracy is in peril, and I do not want to understate that, democracy is fragile, and there is no guarantee that it will survive in any society, and we live in a time when democracy here in this country is in peril. And while religion can fan the flames of polarization, nonetheless, there is hope for American democracy. And religion, I contend, can be a reason for hope, as it has the potential to dampen polarization. But to start, I want to establish 3 facts about religion in the United States. The first, America is religiously diverse. No single religious tradition has a majority in this country. It is true that a majority of Americans do identify with Christianity broadly defined, but Christianity is not a single tradition, not by any stretch of the imagination. And really by any metric, by any measure, America is a highly religiously diverse country. Second, America is on average a religiously devout country, especially when compared to other advanced industrialized liberal democracies. The United States has higher levels of religious beliefs, religious belonging, and behavior. So America is religiously diverse, America is religiously devout, and also, and this is the one where some audiences might bristle a bit, I also want to contend that America is religiously tolerant. Now that one, again, might cause some doubt, but bear with me because I will explain what I mean by that. So America is diverse, it is devout, and it is at least somewhat religiously tolerant. However, each of these 3 features within the United States has over the last number of years been undergoing significant change. First, diversity. Now at the time of the nation's founding, religious diversity meant something very different than it does today. In those days, it meant different flavors of Protestantism, the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians and whatnot. And then throughout the 1800s, the Catholics came. And so diversity began to incorporate the Catholic population. At the same time, there was also a small but significant Jewish population establishing itself in the United States. And then in the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, there was growth in some homegrown religions like the Mormons, as well as non-Western faiths, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. And over the last 20 to 30 years, there's also been a rapid growth in the secular population, or what my co-authors and I have called in a recent book, the secular surge in America. In fact, if people without a religious affiliation are counted as a religious group in the United States, there are more of them than Roman Catholics, the single largest denomination in the country. In short, America has always been religiously diverse by the standards of its time, and today is becoming more diverse in new ways. Now, what about my second point, that America is a religiously devout country? Well, today, the United States is still, on average, more religious than our international peers, so think of nations in Western Europe, or the Canadians, or the Australians. But as suggested by my observation about the secular surge, America is, as a nation, becoming less religious and therefore more secular. Of course, any of us with mutual funds know that past performance is no guarantee of future returns. But for now, the trend lines for religiosity, however measured in the United States, are going down. But even if that levels off, and at some point it almost certainly will, it will be at a lower level than where the United States has been at least since the 1950s and probably even further back than that. And what about my third observation about the United States? That this is a country of religious tolerance. Well, as Michael mentioned, in my work with Robert Putnam, we published a book. It was now 14 years ago in 2010, a book called American Grace, How Religion Divides and unites us. And when we started work on that book, the U.S. seemed deeply divided along religious lines. We started in the George W. Bush administration, so you might remember there was a lot of talk of moral values during the Bush years. Same-sex marriage was a big issue, and there was just a lot of religion in the air, at least when it came to politics. And so we expected to find that Americans would be deeply divided along religious lines in many aspects of their lives. But when we looked at the lived experience of most Americans, we found that most Americans are actually very comfortable with people of other faiths. Now, I don't want to suggest that America then or now was a utopia. Some groups did not and still do not have full acceptance. Muslims still face a lot of hostility. Atheists do, other religious groups as well. And there are some religious Americans who, frankly, are just hostile to everybody. We called them the intolerant tenth in that book. And, 10% of the United States, that's a lot, but that still leaves 90% who are not. And so our book struck a very optimistic tone. Yes, we said our politics was divided by religion, but Americans' everyday lives are not. For many Americans, religion actually serves to unite them, not divide them. But that was then. What about now? And that's the question I want to take up today. Is there still reason for optimism? Can I still claim that America combines religious diversity, devotion, and tolerance? And I assure you that this is not merely an academic question, as it goes right to the heart of American democracy itself. Americans are politically polarized. We hear that all the time. That word can mean different things to different people, but to a political scientist, it generally means that Americans have an increasingly negative perception of those of the other party, on the other side. In fact, among political scientists, or especially those who study American politics, there's a cottage industry now. You might even think of it as an arms race to find yet one more way to make the point that Republicans and Democrats do not like each other. So you maybe have heard some of these factoids that get thrown around in the press. Very low percentage of Americans say they would be comfortable if their child married somebody of the other party. There's research showing that people who are in a position to hire others don't want to hire employees of the other party. There's even research on showing that people of one party think those in the other are somehow less than human. It's sort of like, come up with your version of this and you can get the article published. That's the business we're in these days. And the question is whether religion contributes to those political divisions in America. And if yes, if religion does contribute to polarization, well, that's not good. That's not good for any democracy. Because whenever and wherever social divisions are mutually reinforcing, where party and ethnicity go together, or party and social class go together, or party and religion go together, it threatens to rip a society apart. And I admit that today it might look like interreligious divisions are pulling us apart, whether it's the debate over Israel and Gaza, or, as I'll discuss at some length now, Christian nationalism. As you're no doubt aware, there's been a recent explosion in attention to Christian nationalism. I didn't bring any slides. This is actually the first time a professor has ever given a lecture without PowerPoint slides. This is history in the making. But I didn't bring slides because I thought I could illustrate the very point I wanted to make simply with my hands. So watch closely. If you, for example, look at terms that get mentioned in books, so you can do this through a Google search, because they know everything about everybody, including every book ever published, apparently. If you plug in just the words Christian nationalism, when do they appear in published books? The pattern goes like this. Ready? So there's a steady line, da-da-da-da-da, and then about maybe 8 years ago, there's this sudden and dramatic increase. If you look at just the search terms that people enter into Google, it's exactly the same pattern. Virtually nothing. Nobody was asking about Christian nationalism even 15 years ago, a few 10 years ago. And now, the huge spike, in particular, the greatest spike of all, after the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, because there was a lot of Christian nationalism on display. A lot of the rioters, insurrectionists, were carrying the symbols of Christianity with them. Indeed, we have politicians, including some here in Indiana, who not only advocate for what they call a Christian nationalist philosophy, but proudly describe themselves as Christian nationalists. And they also suggest that this growing secular population is hostile to religion and to Christianity specifically. And you may have seen news reports about an alarmingly high percentage of Americans who are described themselves as Christian nationalists. What, though, if religion is not as divisive as the headlines and as your social media feeds might lead you to think? Consider the following. While those trends that I'm describing with my hands show that the salience, the prominence, the mentions of Christian nationalism are way up, the percentage of Americans who actually hold those beliefs is not rising. It's falling. And what are those beliefs? Well, as you might imagine, there are different definitions, but they all basically boil down to whether Christianity should be privileged in government. And that itself is often condensed into the simple statement that the United States is a Christian nation. But when you scratch below the surface of what people mean when they say that America is a Christian nation, the story is more complicated than it might appear at first. Now, I want to be clear that there are some who hold the view that America is or should be a Christian nation and believe it to be a prescriptive statement. They are antagonistic to those of other faiths. They are dismissive of the First Amendment's prohibition on a state-supported religion. And they believe that public policy, that is, the laws that govern us, should be based on their interpretation of the Bible. So yes, there are some people who believe that. But not all of them. And that's the point I want to drive home. Not all of them. According to the Pew Research Center, which is really the gold standard when it comes to public opinion on these sorts of things, according to the Pew Research Center, about 45% of Americans say the U.S. should be a Christian nation. 45%. So less than half, but that's still a lot. But when you break that down a little bit further, there's a little more nuance to it. So, of that 45%, a third say they don't even know what that means. So Pew would ask a follow-up, what does that mean? Now, that's a funny line. But what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that for those folks, saying that America is a Christian nation is actually probably more of an expression of their own religious faith than it is a political philosophy. Okay? Now, again, of that 45%, a little over a quarter say that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. And a little under a quarter say that the government should advocate for Christian religious values. Okay, so these are the people who are saying the things that we normally associate with Christian nationalism. The federal government should say, U.S. is a Christian nation, and that the government should in some way be advocating for Christian religious values. That's a quarter of 45%. So if you do your math, that works out to about 10% of the population. That's that intolerant tenth that Putnam and I described years ago. And when you dig even further, you find that an even smaller percentage say that the laws of the United States should be based in Christianity. That's only about 3%. 3%. Those are the people who are truly Christian nationalists. Now, 3% of the U.S. population of over 300 million, that's still a lot of people. And they're not equally distributed around the country. You'll be shocked to hear that we probably have more in Indiana than, say, in Oregon or Massachusetts. But it's still a much smaller share than you might be led to believe simply by the amount of attention that Christian nationalism receives. It's also worth noting that some who say that the U.S. is a Christian nation, when they say that, what they mean is simply a descriptive point. And they're not wrong, actually. Numerically, while the overall share of Christians in the United States is falling, it is still a majority. Although, again, I'll remind you that to describe someone as a Christian spans a wide range of faiths. That goes from the high church mainline Protestants to the Episcopalians, to the black church, to evangelical megachurches, to the Catholics, and a whole bunch of other groups as well. And yet others who describe the United States as a Christian nation, they mean it aspirationally. So to go back to that 45% who, when asked, off the top of their heads, is the U.S. a Christian nation? Say yes. About half of them say that the federal government should advocate for moral values that are shared by people of many faiths. Now, you can disagree whether, that is the way we ought to base our laws, but that's a very different way of thinking about what it means to say the U.S. is a Christian nation than to say, no, it's my way or the highway. So in other words, while Christian nationalism is a presence in American society, I don't want to understate that, we should put that presence in perspective. But some people might ask, what about the founding fathers? Didn't they believe that the U.S. should be a Christian nation? Well, here's the thing. Who do you mean by the founding fathers? It's an amorphous group, just trying to decide who's in and who's out. It's a matter of some debate. But whoever gets counted is in the group. Keep in mind that these were strongly opinionated people who often disagreed with one another. The musical Hamilton does a wonderful job. It really does, of illustrating that point. That why would we assume that smart people like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, that they all agreed on things? No, that's why they went to Philadelphia and had a big debate over what should go into the Constitution. And specifically, they disagreed on the role of religion in government, or what today we loosely call the separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson, who most famously used the term the wall of separation, wanted to keep church and state far apart. George Washington wanted to see religion in general promoted in society, but not a particular denomination. And I'll also note, to Washington's credit, he was very welcoming of Jews, which at the time was radical. James Madison, he was in between Jefferson and Washington. In other words, there was no single view of the founders on the specifics of church and state. But they did agree on the general principle of the First Amendment of the Constitution that says that there would be no established or no state religion. And so if anyone ever says to you, the founders believed that America should be a Christian nation, ask them, which founders? And then ask, but wait, didn't they all agree on the Establishment Clause? The provision in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights that said there would be no state religion? And of course, they also all agreed on the Free Exercise Clause, which states that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Not Christianity, religion, and religion of any sort, and that includes the freedom not to be religious at all. In the words of Thomas Jefferson himself, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. It's a wonderful Jeffersonian phrase. Neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. All right, now, if Christian nationalism is a small and shrinking view, what about the secular surge? Surely the growing secular population in America must be hostile to religion. Well, not at all, actually. It turns out that secular Americans are actually very supportive of religious free exercise, at least up until the point that it infringes on the rights of others. So, for example, most secular Americans reject the idea that, say, a florist or a baker, or these sorts of businesses, can refuse to do business with a gay couple who are getting married. They are also wary of anything that even hints at a state-established religion, such as the display of religious monuments in government buildings. But these views are hardly radical. In fact, it puts them in good stead historically. For one, they sound an awful lot like Thomas Jefferson, or for that matter, they sound a lot like the Baptists, at least up until the 1970s. Now again, I don't want to make it sound like the United States is beyond reproach, far from it. Sadly, we live with some religious intolerance and hostility and antagonism, sometimes even violence in this country. We live with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and we all know that both of those have been on display in recent months and years. But I do want to suggest that America today is at a crossroads, and we can go down one of two paths. And each of those paths has consequences for the health and perhaps even the survival of American democracy. The first path is that religion and secularism can be yet one more way that Americans pull apart from one another. And tragically, there is indeed some evidence that this has begun to happen. The more that religion is associated with conservative politicians, the more that Americans in the middle and on the left experience what has come to be called backlash and pull away from religion altogether, because to them religion equals conservative or Republican or some combination. And even if they don't totally abandon religion, America's congregations are increasingly segregated along political lines. That's one path. We could continue to go that way. There is, however, a second way. And down this path, religion is the exception to the political polarization that we otherwise experience. Now, is that naive of me to say? Well, let me go back to my earlier work on the role of religion in American society. Remember I told you that at a time when it seemed like our politics was deeply divided along religious lines, that was actually not true in Americans' personal lives. And the reason for that is virtually all Americans have neighbors, coworkers, family members, often even their own children or a spouse who are of another faith, or they're of a faith, and the family member or the friend is not religious at all, or some combination thereof. In fact, to give you an example, ripped from the headlines, Kamala Harris, you've heard of her? We're learning a lot about her biography. You know, Kamala Harris grew up attending both a Baptist church and a Hindu temple, and is currently married to a Jewish husband. That is not an unusual story in today's America. That is a very common story. And that matters, because those kinds of relationships foster greater acceptance and greater tolerance. And whether that happens, that all depends on us. And what does that have to do with American democracy? Well, democracies require a healthy culture. There has to be an agreement on some fundamental norms and a bedrock of trust in one another. The jargony term for that is social capital. And if Americans continue to form these relationships across religious and secular lines, it will foster a healthier culture. And so while partisanship might pull us apart, at a minimum, religion need not contribute to polarization, and perhaps can even counteract it. Because if we can have relationships across interfaith lines, perhaps we can even form relationships across political lines. And so the great question for all of us, myself included, is which road do we take? Do we go down the path where religion divides us? Or do we choose the path where recognizing different religious and secular worldviews helps us all find common ground? And it is my hope that we all choose seeking common ground. Now, I started by telling you about that woman with the soda bread. But I didn't tell you whether I got the soda bread. Well, I'm proud to tell you I got the bread. And I don't know whether you all today would give me your metaphorical soda bread, but I can say that I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here, and I look forward to talking with more of you afterwards. Thank you very much.